Is this on?
Yes,
Yeah. As you know, I'm a retired history professor, and a long and very agreeable career teaching, researching, publishing, but my field was Spanish history. That's where I did almost all my research. To be more specific, I dealt with the rural population of Spain, central Spain, part of Spain which we call Castilla, or Castile. In the 1500s, I never did Texas history, and I never did Swedish colonies. And I probably never would have, had it not been for the fact that in 1985, a state historical plaque was raised near where Stockholm, Texas used to be. When I heard of that, I wasn't there, but I read about it in the paper, and somebody told me about it also. I thought, you know, it would really be fun if I could write an article about Stockholm, Texas, because I hadn't seen any such thing. That was in 1985. But then I forgot about it because I had a plate full of other things to do. I was doing Spanish history, I was spending time in Spain, etc., etc. So I really didn't give my attention to Stockholm, Texas until I retired from teaching. That was in 1997. By then it was almost too late. In 1997, almost all the original pioneers had died, or if they were still living, their memory wasn't the way it used to be. They suffered my problem with memory. Anyway, it's already been mentioned that my parents and my grandparents were members of the Stockholm, Texas community, so it was kind of a family thing for me to do it. Anyhow, when I decided that I would write this article, I found that the people I really should have interviewed were dead, or no longer were as sharp as they should have been. And very, very discouraging, I discovered that almost nothing had been published about Stockholm, Texas. But I did what I could. I figured, well, an article wouldn't be too difficult to research. I interviewed a couple of dozen surviving pioneers and their descendants. I found that the courthouse records in Raymondville and in Brownsville and in Edinburgh were very helpful. And after spending about 4 years in research, I looked at what I had and I discovered that there was more than I needed for, a lot more than I needed for an article, that I could make a book out of it. And that's how the book really came to be. The book project, including not only research but also including trying to get it published, took 5 years. And I decided to name it Stockholm on the Rio Grande. You might have been struck by the title. Stockholm is not on the Rio Grande. It is a number of miles away from the Rio Grande, but when the Swedish colony was first formed, the Rio Grande flooded every time there was a big rain upriver, and Stockholm was flooded. I decided to call it Stockholm on the Rio Grande. I thought, well, people are going to find that interesting. You might want to read about what could have happened. Let me briefly summarize the history of Stockholm, Texas. Before the 20th 20th century, almost all the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas was ranch country. There was very little else economically going on. You had large ranches, very thinly populated with humans. Most of them were of Mexican background or were actually Mexicans who crossed the border, because back in those days nobody paid much attention to whether you were legal or not legal. In any case, the ranches were mesquite thickets. You had thorny mesquites, you had cacti, you had other thorny bushes. In fact, some of the Swedes who came down to live in the area said every living thing in the natural vegetation has thorns. So the only ones that don't have thorns are the land agents. He said, and they're pretty smooth. Anyhow, before the 20th century, nearly all the Rio Grande Valley was isolated from the rest of the country, the rest of the state. You couldn't get there except on unpaved and often ungraded roads, or trails, basically, to get through the ranch country between Brownsville and Kingsville, or between Edinburgh and Alps. So the valley was isolated. It was hard to get there from the rest of the country, and it remained isolated until 1904, when the railroad reached Brownsville. That opened up the Lower Rio Grande Valley to development. You could get to the valley with the railroad, and you could get valley products using the railroad from the Lower Grande Valley to the rest of the country. Valley products were particularly cotton and citrus and winter vegetables. Once the railroad was down there, clever individuals realized that in a developing area like that, you could make a lot of money if you were smart. A lot of folks looked at the situation. They discovered they could buy ranch country. You could buy entire ranches for as little as $1 an acre. They could subdivide those ranches and sell them for $30, $40, $50, $60, $75 an acre, depending on where they were. So a lot of money was being made and could be made. In 1912, a group of Swedes living in Minneapolis decided they would take advantage of the profit potentials of the valley. They bought a ranch called the Turner Tract, named after a former owner. It was over 12,000 acres in size. That's a large chunk of real estate. And they decided to transform those 12,000 acres into a Swedish colony. They advertised in Swedish newspapers all over the country and in Canada as well. And almost every part of North America that had any Swedes to speak of had a Swedish newspaper. It was probably only a monthly, or perhaps a weekly newspaper, but you could have ads. Circulated, you can see one of the ads that appears in the Texas Post. And he called Stockholm a Swedish colony. Not just a community, but a colony. Okay, very interesting. In any case, in the ads, they touted the mild climate, the fact that it rarely froze in winter. They pictured the valley as kind of a Garden of Eden, where you had palm trees, you had banana trees, you had orange and grapefruit trees. It said, come down here where the soil is so fertile, it goes down 2 or 3 feet, unlike in most parts of the country where if you have 6 inches of soil, that's a lot. And special train cars were arranged to bring people from the north, mainly Minnesota, Illinois, in that area. Wherever there were Swedes, they could come down the valley and be given a tour showing everything that was good about the valley, to be sure, and forgetting the things that weren't so good. In any case, a lot of Swedes decided that was the place they wanted to live. My 2 grandparents, my 2 grandfathers decided they wanted to go down there, particularly because the land prices were relatively low compared with Minnesota or other parts of the north. And they liked the idea of cold winter, staying up north, and they would go down to South Texas where they could be warm. Anyhow, the idea of joining a Swedish colony was very, very successful. And by 1914, about 150 Swedes had bought land in the Turner Tract. 150 Swedes. That's landowners who typically had wives and children, so it's far more than 150 Swedes. Look at the map, if you will. You can see that the area in black of the Turner Tract was pretty much in the middle of the southern tip of Texas. It was in the middle of Hidalgo and Cameron and Wilson counties. So that seems, looking at it seems like a very good choice of location for the Swedish colony. The land was almost perfectly flat there. They had some what we call hills. In fact, my wife and I, when we first married, we lived in what we called a house on a hill. The hill was probably as much as 3 feet high. But they called it a hill because it was high enough so when the Rio Grande flooded, the house wouldn't be underwater.
We were on real high ground. We were 11.
You were 11, wow.
I was in the same, I was right down the road from you on that house on the hill.
Yeah.
Just north, about a mile or so.
Yeah, and we had a perpetual slough in between us.
Exactly. Good swimming hole.
Yeah.
I've spent a lot of time in Harlingen.
Yes, Harlingen is right there. Yeah. So, we have a lot of Swedes moving down there, and they called, notice again, call your attention to the ad in Texas Post. They called it Stockholm. They wanted to emphasize the fact that this was going to be a colony for Swedes. And initially the idea was they would only sell to Swedes. They only wanted Swedes to live there. And other Swedes liked the idea of living with Swedes. That was one of the essential elements that my grandfathers looked for. They wanted a nice climate, they wanted reasonable prices for land, and they wanted to be around other Swedes. So in Stockholm, the founders of the colony called it Stockholm, and that's what everybody began calling it. It was Stockholm. It wasn't much of a city. It never was really a city, as a matter of fact. It never was an incorporated municipality. Never even had a post office. All the mail was in Lyford, between 5 and 8 miles away from the Turner Tract. Dozens of families moved to Stockholm, Texas. They built houses, they cleared the mesquite brush, they began farming. So in the teens and the 20s, the Stockholm Swedish colony was a great success. I found it interesting in my research that almost all Swedish families had first lived elsewhere in the U.S., particularly Minnesota, but the other northern states. One set of my grandparents came from Minnesota, the other came from Alberta, Canada, although they had first lived in I only found one individual out of hundreds that I looked at who had been associated with Stockholm, Texas. I only found one who came directly from Sweden to Stockholm, Texas. That was Nils Carlson, for those of you who are from that area. And he came because he had an uncle named Baker who was Swedish, despite the name. And the uncle was kind of his sugar daddy. There was a general store in Stockholm where you could buy just about anything you needed. And that was important because in the early years, there were no roads between Stockholm and Leipzig. You wanted to go to Leipzig, that's where the development was actually happening. What was I going to say?
Vassberg was on the railroad.
Yeah, there was a little store. There was a meeting house that the developers had constructed. The meeting house was used for get-togethers to decide what they wanted the area to be like and what they wanted to do. It was also used as a church and used as a school. Eventually, a separate school was constructed. It was dependent on the school district in Leipzig. And the school was a typical rural one-room schoolhouse. It gave only elementary education. If you wanted to go to high school, you had to go to Leipzig. That meant you probably had to ride a horse or a mule for half an hour to get there. When the children of the Swedish colony first went to school in this little one-room schoolhouse, they were already bilingual. But their bilingualism did not include English. They were bilingual in Swedish and Spanish. They spoke Swedish because that was the language of family communication. Their mothers and their fathers and their siblings spoke Swedish. They also spoke Spanish because nearly all these Swedish farmers hired Mexican workers to help them with their chores. And the Mexican workers brought their families with them. So the Swedish kids naturally played with the Mexican kids. I asked the descendant of one of the original founders whether he had learned Spanish before he went to school. He said yes. So I had to learn Spanish to play marbles with the Mexican kids. And that's how it worked. In any case, the Swedish kids, the children of the Swedish pioneers in Stockholm, Texas, when they first went to school, they didn't speak English. You might think that was tough because the teachers used only English. The teachers were never Swedish. They didn't speak or understand Swedish. So the kids were thrown total immersion into a school situation that must have been difficult. But they handled it well. Within 2 or 3 years, these little Swedish kids were speaking English. In fact, they learned it so well, not only to speak, but also to read and to write, that they preferred using English between them. So they knew Swedish, but among themselves they preferred to use English. That meant that the Swedish language was relegated to a situation where it was only used for grandparents, parents, and God, because they worshipped in Swedish. In fact, the Swedish children and a lot of the adult Swedes also learned Spanish so well and so rapidly that a lot of monolingual Anglos came to believe that Swedish and Spanish must be closely related languages. It wasn't true at all. But it was a good thing that most of the Swedes turned out to be trilingual because they had to deal with monolingual Mexicans and with monolingual Anglos. about dealing with the Mexicans, the Swedes generally got along well with the Mexicans. I think probably because the Swedes came ultimately from Sweden, where they had no dark-skinned people to speak of, or they came from Minnesota or from Wisconsin or other northern states, where they had very few, if any, dark-skinned people, whereas the Anglos who were in Texas often came from Georgia or Mississippi, Alabama, where they had very strong prejudices against people who had dark skin. Swedes didn't feel that way. They tended to get along well. The Swedes in Stockholm, Texas were devout Protestant Christians. They believed in having frequent prayer meetings, initially in their homes, frequent services, and they were always exclusively in the Swedish language. The Swedes thought that the Swedish language was a part of their Christianity. How can you be Christians and not speak Swedish? As the colony began, there were not very many Swedes who were established in the area. There were so few in numbers that they decided, well, some of us are Lutherans, some of them are Covenanters, some of them are Methodists, but why don't we just worship together? So they worshiped together for a number of years, and it wasn't long before these doctrinal differences began to surface. If you're talking about religion, it can be very important to you how you baptize someone, when you baptize someone, how you take the Lord's Supper, and when you take it, what you take exactly. My Uncle Clarence was livid once because he went to a Lutheran church where they actually broke bread. He said, if I haven't had a wafer, I haven't had communion. So it wasn't long before doctrinal differences surfaced, and the Swedish community divided into 3 different denominations. The largest were the Covenanters. The Covenant Church in Stockholm, Texas was independent, but it was very, very close to the National Covenant, Evangelical Covenant Church. Doctrinally it was. The second most numerous religion was Lutheran. The Lutheran Church, of course, was a state church in Sweden, so this was the one that was sending missionaries, you might say, to make sure that the Swedes worshipped the way they were supposed to. And there were Swedish Methodists. The Methodists were the smallest in number, and it wasn't long before they Americanized. Let's see. Yeah, by 1926, when the Lutherans decided that they were wealthy enough so they could build a church, they decided not to build it in Stockholm, but rather to build it in Lyford. Lyford was a better location. If you look at the map, you can see the railroad passed through Lyford. The only decent roads passed through Lyford. In order to get from Stockholm to Lyford, you had to go over an animal trail, basically. That was not even graded through the first years. Also in 1926, the Methodists, who were very small in number, decided that they would move to Lyford and join with the Anglo-Methodists. Beginning in 1926, the Methodists no longer had services in Sweden, in Swedish. But the Lutherans and the Covenanters continued to have Swedish services into the 1930s and even 40s. But acquiescing in the inevitable, the Swedish congregations, one by one, even your hardcore conservatives, one by one, they realized that their Swedish churches would eventually disappear because their children prefer to use English. So one by one they switched over to English. By the 1940s, they'd all become anglicized in terms of language used for services. And with the passage of years, the little Swedish colony in Stockholm gradually disintegrated. The main reason it disintegrated was that the Swedes very rapidly decided that they wanted to be Americans. And my notes tell me oh yes, the Great Depression. How can I forget that? The Great Depression of the 1930s really hit Stockholm, Texas hard. A lot of the small farmers weren't making a living, and they decided to give it up. Often it's because they didn't like the hot summers either. They decided to go back to where they came from. Go back to Minnesota, go back to Canada. My paternal grandmother tried to come down to the valley and live there, but she hated it. She experienced a hurricane, she experienced a flood, she experienced hordes of bugs that were biting her, and she was allergic to everything. And after being there less than a year, she told her husband, in Swedish to be sure, I don't speak Swedish, she said, "John, I can't take it anymore. You can stay here if you want. I'm going back home to Alberta. And you can visit me in the summer." Which she did. Yeah, I was going to say by the summer of 1935, thanks to these various forces, particularly the Great Depression, only 15 of the original Swedish families were still operating farms, and the number continued to decline. Today, there are only 2 Swedish farmers still operating in the Turner Tract area. One was, this still exists. One is owned by my cousins Charles and Danny Vassberg. The other is owned by Wilbur and Bob. And in both cases, it's my understanding, I haven't measured, but it's my understanding in both cases their farms are perhaps 8,000 acres. And by the 1950s, all these factors operating against the survival of Stockholm, Texas. By the mid-1950s, Stockholm was no longer a viable community. The Methodists no longer use it for services. The Lutherans had moved to Lyford. In 1952, the Covenant Church also moved to Lyford. They jacked up the church, put it on a trailer, and literally pulled it to Lyford. Excuse me. Same thing with the school. The school was owned by the Lyford School District, and there were so few children there. And you have, in the handout I gave, there's a photograph of one of the school years, I guess. And the scribbling on it was done by the person who gave me the original photograph. That was one of the Vassberg girls, I think. Oh yeah, so they jacked up the Stockholm schoolhouse and pulled it into Lyford, where it was used as the school cafeteria, where I ate, and so did Shirley, and so did Clifford.
I didn't know that's where it was.
That's where it came from.
That was
Yeah,
our
it was.
first before
What's
the
that?
new one. The old cafeteria was the cover.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
I didn't know that.
If if I'm not mistaken, the parsonage was your grandmother's house, is that right?
Yes, it was, that's right.
But not in Stockholm, it was in Lyford.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
But the Lyford area was still part of the community.
Yeah.
Okay. So Stockholm, by 1952, really had nothing there to show that it was a town at all. The church was gone. The churches were gone. The meeting house was gone. The school was gone. The only thing that indicated that there had ever been a community there was the cemetery.
There was still a gym.
There was a gym.
I remember a gym.
There was a gym, but it was run by non-Swedes.
Yeah.
Okay, the main reason for Lyford's ascendancy was Stockholm was in the early days, it was located along a non-paved, in fact, not even graded road. By the 1940s, the counties were grading the roads were better, and people were buying automobiles, so they could very easily get to Lyford. They didn't have to buy things from a little store that didn't really carry what they wanted. So Lyford became the logical center for social and economic interactions. On top of that came the worldwide, particularly the American-wide, mechanization of agriculture. The 40-acre farm could no longer support a family. So one by one, the little farms were gobbled up by the big farms, and you ended up in the situation I talked about a moment ago. Today, if you go to Stockholm, Texas, you'll discover there are no signs indicating Stockholm. There used to be. Remember that?
Long behind.
One
Long
little
Island,
sign.
there used to be. But I think those signs appeared, I tried to do some research and find out when they put the signs up saying Stockholm, but I couldn't find it. I should have spent a couple more years doing research, I guess. But I think somebody phoned the highway department saying, look, there was a Swedish colony there. We need to put up Stockholm signs. So they did. By that time, there was nothing there. So after a few years, they jerked the signs out.
That's the nice.
Yeah, for the most part, they are of Hispanic background. And so that's it. Stockholm came and prospered for a while. And it ended. So what do we make of that? You can say, on the one hand, you can say that the Swedish colony was a failure. After all, it began to disintegrate within 20 years of its founding. Never had a post office. Never was an incorporated municipality. 40 years after it was established, Stockholm, Texas was a ghost town. Nobody lived there. Or if they did, there were no Swedes. Today, nobody in the area of the old Turner Tract, nobody speaks Swedish anymore. On the other hand, we can view the rise and fall of the little Swedish colony not as a failure, but as a big success story. This was a story of the Americanization of alien cultures, alien languages coming in and gradually assimilating with the American Anglo language and for the most part the custom. If you're interested in the book, and I'm sorry I didn't bring more, I didn't have more copies to bring you. I've never been a book salesman. I always turn that over to the publisher or the bookstores. If you're interested in the book, you can borrow a copy through your local library. They probably won't have one, but they can get it through interlibrary loan. The University of Texas in Austin has at least 2 copies that I know of. Texas State in San Marcos has 1 copy. Most university libraries have a copy of it. I donated a copy to the Austin Public Library. The last I looked at their catalog, it wasn't up yet. You can also purchase a copy through your local bookstore, or you can go online and you can find that Amazon.com will have it. All you have to do is ask for books in Stockholm on the Rio Grande, and my book is the only one that will come up. I'll put my name down, and that will enable you to buy not only the Stockholm book, but several other books that I've published. The retail price is very high, $62.50. So I would suggest, unless you really want to own the book, that you try to borrow one. So, that's all I was going to say. If there's time, I'll answer a couple of questions.
Dr. Vassberg, the Vassberg farm, your family farm, are they cultivating cotton, maize? What are they now?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm. It was based, well, initially, my father tried to be a traditional small farmer. So he planted cotton and grain, some vegetables in the winter. He had pigs, he had chickens, he had some cattle. And eventually he decided that it was far more profitable just to be an arable farmer and to concentrate on cotton and grain. And that is basically what my cousins grew today.
And the other family, what did you say their name was?
Malma, M-A-L-M.
What did you say they grow now?
Cotton and grain sorghums. Some other crops can be grown, but those are the crops. Another question? Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Did the Gustafson family play a major role down there?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. You can look under Gustafson. There are a lot of Gustafsons in my directory. Oh, and one thing about the book. Less than half of the book is about the story of Stockholm, Texas. Far more is dedicated to a directory of people who lived in Stockholm, Texas, obviously, or who bought land in the colony, or visited the colony. I was looking through just out of curiosity before I came here and discovered there are 2 Bergströms on my list, and about 5 dozen Johnsons. Another question? Ben, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Vassberg. Okay, we're going to have a drawing.